They pitied me at my husband's funeral, and I let them, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe exactly what they want to believe. I stood there in my simple black dress, the same one I'd worn for the past 5 years, hands folded neatly in front of me as if I had nowhere else to be and nothing else left to hold on to, while people whispered just loud enough for me to hear. "Poor Evelyn," someone murmured behind me. "I don't know how she's going to manage now." I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. I simply nodded when they offered their condolences, accepted their gentle touches on my arm, and kept my voice soft and steady as I thanked them for coming, because that was what they expected from a 72-year-old widow who had just buried her husband of 40 years. Across the room, I caught sight of my son Daniel standing beside his wife, Vanessa, both of them dressed impeccably, as if they had stepped out of a magazine instead of into a funeral home. Vanessa leaned closer to him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and though she lowered her voice, I saw the way her lips moved, the way her eyes flicked briefly toward me before she whispered something that made Daniel's shoulders tighten. He didn't look at me after that. He just nodded once, slowly, like he had already made a decision he didn't want to explain. I recognized that look. I had seen it once before, years ago, when he chose to follow Vanessa's opinion over his own. The room felt colder in that moment, not because of the air conditioning humming quietly above us, but because I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit until now. They weren't just grieving. They were calculating. I moved slowly through the crowd, thanking old friends, acknowledging distant relatives, listening to the same hollow reassurances repeated over and over again. "If you need anything," they said, but their eyes always softened with that same quiet pity, as if they were already imagining me alone in a dim house, struggling to pay bills, fading quietly into the background of my own life. I kept my expression gentle, my posture steady, even as I felt Vanessa's gaze settle on me. Again, sharper this time, more deliberate. When our eyes finally met, she offered me a small, sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I knew in that instant that she had already decided what would happen next. I had seen that smile before too. It was the one she used when she believed she was in control. I lowered my gaze, letting my shoulders sink just enough to complete the picture they had already painted of me, because the truth was, I needed them to believe it. I needed them to see me as fragile, as lost, as someone who had nothing left, because only then would they show me exactly who they really were. And as I stood there beside my husband's casket, listening to the quiet hum of voices and the soft rustle of movement around me, I realized something with perfect clarity. They thought this was the moment I had lost everything. They were wrong. This was the moment I began to see everything. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as if the world itself is waiting to see what you will do next, and I moved through my routine with the same measured calm I had carried the night before, making coffee, opening the curtains, letting the pale sunlight fall across the kitchen table where Richard used to sit reading the newspaper. I poured a second cup out of habit, then paused, my hand resting on the handle, before setting it back down untouched. It was a small thing, but even small things reveal the truth of what has changed and what has not. By mid-morning, my phone rang, and I already knew who it would be before I picked it up. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice careful, almost rehearsed, "Vanessa and I were thinking we could come by today. Just to check on you." I could hear the pause behind his words, the unspoken reason layered beneath them, and I smiled faintly even though he could not see it. "That would be fine," I replied, keeping my tone soft, steady, exactly as they expected. "I will be here." They arrived an hour later, right on time, as if this were an appointment rather than a visit. Vanessa stepped inside first, her eyes moving quickly through the room, taking in every detail, every piece of furniture. Every sign that nothing had been disturbed. Daniel followed, his expression unreadable, though I noticed the way he lingered near the doorway for a moment before closing it behind him. "The house looks exactly the same," Vanessa said lightly, as if it were a compliment, though there was something else beneath it, something sharper. "I suppose that makes sense." I nodded, gesturing toward the living room. "It has always been enough," I said simply, and watched as she processed those words, measuring them for meaning that was not there. We sat together, the three of us, the distance between us not measured in feet but in something far less visible and far more significant. Vanessa crossed her legs, her posture relaxed, confident, as if she had already stepped into a role she had been waiting to claim. "Evelyn," she began, her voice gentle in a way that felt practiced, "we have been talking about what might be best for you moving forward. This house is quite large, and the upkeep alone can be overwhelming." Daniel shifted slightly beside her but did not interrupt. I folded my hands in my lap, letting a small pause settle into the room before I answered. "I have managed it for many years," I said quietly. "I do not find it overwhelming." Vanessa smiled again, patient, as if explaining something to a child. "Of course, but things change. And it might be more comfortable for you somewhere with less responsibility. Somewhere with support." There it was. Not a suggestion. A direction. I let my gaze drift briefly to Daniel, waiting, giving him the opportunity to say something that might change the course of this conversation. He did not. Instead, he cleared his throat and added, "It is just something to think about, Mom. We want what is best for you." The words were familiar, comforting on the surface, but empty underneath, and I recognized them for what they were. Not concern. Preparation. I nodded slowly, as if considering their idea, as if weighing options I had already decided not to take. "I will think about it," I said, and watched the way Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just slightly, the way her eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction. They believed they had taken the first step. They believed I had begun to yield. And as I sat there in the house I had built, listening to them discuss my future as if I were no longer fully part of it, I understood that they were not just testing the boundaries of my patience. They were revealing the limits of their own character. And that was something I intended to remember. After they left that afternoon, the house felt quieter than it had the night before, but not in the same way, not empty, but observant, as if it had begun to listen with me instead of simply holding memories. I stood by the front window and watched their car pull out of the driveway, Vanessa speaking animatedly while Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his hands tight on the steering wheel, and I did not need to hear their words to understand the direction of their conversation. They believed progress had been made. They believed I had begun to accept the idea of leaving. I turned away from the window and walked slowly back into the living room, my steps measured, my thoughts clearer than they had been in years. It is a strange thing, clarity. It does not arrive loudly. It settles in quietly, replacing confusion one piece at a time until what once felt complicated becomes almost simple. I sat down in Richard's chair and let my gaze move across the room, not with nostalgia, but with recognition, as if I were seeing everything not as it had been, but as it truly was. For years, I had told myself that Daniel was just busy, that marriage had changed his priorities, that distance was a natural part of life. I had explained away the missed calls, the shortened visits, the way conversations had slowly become more about convenience than connection. I had told myself that Vanessa was simply strong-willed, that her sharp edges were a matter of personality, not intention. But sitting there now, with the echo of her carefully chosen words still lingering in the air, I began to trace those moments differently. I remember the first time she had suggested cancelling a holiday dinner because it would be too much for me, even though I had already prepared everything. I remembered the way Daniel had agreed without hesitation, how easily. The decision had been made without me. I remembered smaller things too, things that had seemed insignificant at the time, like the way she would answer questions directed at him, or the way she would gently redirect conversations whenever I tried to bring up plans that did not include her. None of it had been loud. None of it had been obvious. It had been subtle, gradual, almost invisible, like a slow shift in the foundation of something you assume is steady. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together, and allowed those memories to settle into place, not with anger, but with understanding. Because that was the difference now. I was no longer trying to protect the image of what our family had been. I was seeing it for what it had become. And more importantly, I was beginning to see what they believed it would become next. They thought this house was simply an asset waiting to be claimed. They thought my silence was weakness, that my willingness to listen meant I would eventually agree. They thought time was on their side. I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting once more toward the hallway that led to the study, where the truth remained exactly where it had always been, untouched, unseen. $28 million was not just a number. It was a measure of choice. And for the first time, I realized that the decision before me was not about money at all. It was about whether I would allow them to define the end of my story, or whether I would decide, quietly and completely, how it would unfold. I stood up then, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my dress, and walked toward the kitchen to begin preparing dinner, not because I was hungry, but because routine has a way of anchoring intention. As I moved through the familiar motions, I made a decision that felt as steady as the house around me. I would not confront them. Not yet. I would not correct their assumptions or challenge their plans. Instead, I would give them exactly what they expected to see, and in doing so, I would give myself something far more valuable than immediate resolution. I would give myself time. And time, I knew now, was the one thing they had already started to underestimate. 2 days passed before they returned, and in that time I made sure nothing about my life suggested change, nothing that would disrupt the image they had already accepted as truth. I kept the curtains drawn just enough to soften the light, wore the same modest clothes, and left the small imperfections untouched, a stack of unopened mail on the side table, a faint dusting on the bookshelf, details that quietly reinforced the idea of someone overwhelmed, someone slowly falling behind. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I took a moment before answering, not to compose myself, but to maintain the rhythm I had begun to create. Vanessa stood there with a polite smile, a folder tucked neatly under her arm, while Daniel hovered just behind her, his expression neutral but distant. "We thought we could go over a few things," Vanessa said as she stepped inside, her voice warm but purposeful, as if this visit had been carefully planned down to the smallest detail. I nodded and led them into the living room, noticing immediately how her eyes moved again, measuring, assessing, confirming that everything was exactly as she expected it to be. We sat down, and without hesitation, she placed the folder on the coffee table between us, opening it with a quiet sense of confidence that did not need to announce itself. "I did a little research," she continued, sliding a few papers toward me, "just to help make things easier for you." I glanced down at the documents, recognizing the layout of real estate listings, assisted living brochures, and estimated property values, all neatly organized, all presented as if they were solutions rather than suggestions. "There are some very nice communities nearby," she added, tapping lightly on one of the pages. "Places where you would not have to worry about maintenance or expenses." Daniel shifted slightly beside her but still said nothing, his silence now familiar enough that I no longer waited for it to break. I picked up one of the brochures, letting my fingers rest on the glossy paper as I read the description of shared dining rooms, scheduled activities, and quiet, contained living, and I allowed a small pause to settle before I spoke. "It looks very organized," I said calmly, placing the paper back down. Vanessa smiled, encouraged. "Exactly. It would give you stability." Stability. The word lingered in the air, carefully chosen, intentionally placed. I folded my hands again, letting my gaze move briefly from her to Daniel, then back. "And the house?" I asked, my tone neutral, almost absent of concern. That was all it took. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her posture shifting with subtle anticipation. "Well, given the current market, it would be the perfect time to sell. We could handle everything for you, of course. Make sure you get a fair price." "We." "Not you." "Not me." "We." I nodded slowly, as if processing something complicated, when in truth the simplicity of it was almost striking. "That sounds like a lot to manage," I said quietly, letting just enough hesitation enter my voice. Vanessa reached out then, placing her hand gently over mine, her touch light, controlled. "That is why you have us," she said. "You do not have to carry this alone." I looked down at her hand for a moment before meeting her eyes again, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly see the certainty there, the quiet assumption that this was already decided. I gave a small, almost grateful smile, the kind that would confirm everything she believed. "I appreciate that," I said softly. And in that moment, I watched as something settled in her expression, a sense of completion, as if the final piece had just fallen into place. They believed I was beginning to depend on them. They believed the outcome was inevitable. And as the conversation continued, as plans were discussed and timelines were gently suggested, I did nothing to disrupt that belief. Because the more certain they became, the less careful they would be. And I had already learned that the truth people reveal when they feel secure is far more valuable than anything they say when they are uncertain. The following week unfolded exactly as I expected, not because I controlled every moment, but because I understood the pattern they had already fallen into, and patterns, once revealed, rarely change without reason. Vanessa began calling more frequently, always. With the same gentle tone, always framing her suggestions as concern rather than direction, asking if I had looked into the community she had recommended, if I needed help organizing paperwork, if I was feeling overwhelmed. Each time, I answered the same way, with quiet appreciation and just enough uncertainty to encourage her to continue. I have been thinking about it, I would say, letting my voice carry a softness that suggested hesitation rather than resistance. And each time, I could hear the satisfaction beneath her response, subtle but unmistakable, like someone watching a plan move forward exactly as intended. Daniel, on the other hand, remained mostly silent. His presence felt more through absence than action, a few brief calls, a short visit where he spent more time checking his phone than speaking, as if he had already distanced himself from whatever outcome he believed was coming. I did not question it. I did not challenge him. Instead, I observed, noting the way he deferred to Vanessa even when he did not need to, the way his words mirrored hers, as if repetition alone could make something feel true. One afternoon, they arrived again, this time with a different kind of energy, less tentative, more assured. Vanessa carried another folder, thicker than the last, and placed it on the table with a quiet confidence that did not require explanation. We made some calls, she said, opening it to reveal documents already prepared, forms partially completed, signatures marked with small tabs where mine would be required. Just to make things easier for you. I leaned forward slightly, studying the pages without touching them, recognizing the structure of what she had assembled, a process already set in motion, waiting only for my agreement to become final. You have been very thorough, I said calmly, and watched the way her expression softened, as if she had been waiting for that acknowledgement. We just want to make sure everything is taken care of, she replied, her tone steady, reassuring, practiced. I nodded slowly, allowing a pause to stretch just long enough to suggest I was considering something carefully. It is a lot to think about, I said, my voice quiet, measured. I have lived here a long time. Vanessa leaned in slightly, her posture attentive, persuasive without appearing forceful. And that is exactly why this is the right time, she said. You deserve to be comfortable. To not have to worry about things like this anymore. I let her words settle, then gave a small, almost reluctant nod. Perhaps you are right, I said, and in that moment, something shifted in the room, something subtle but significant. Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just slightly, her smile becoming more certain, while Daniel finally looked up, his expression easing in a way that suggested relief rather than reflection. They believed the decision had been made. They believed I had reached the conclusion they had been guiding me toward all along. And as I sat there, listening to them discuss timelines, next steps, the details of how everything would unfold, I realized that they were no longer cautious. They were no longer watching their words as carefully. Vanessa spoke more freely now, her confidence allowing small truths to slip through, comments about how this will make things so much easier for everyone and how it is important to act quickly while the market is strong, phrases that revealed more than they concealed. I did not interrupt. I did not question. I simply listened, committing each word to memory, because clarity does not come from confrontation. It comes from patience. And as their voices filled the room, as their plans became more detailed and their assumptions more certain, I understood that we had reached a turning point, not because of anything I had said, but because of everything they believed. They thought they were guiding me toward an ending. They did not realize they were stepping directly into one. The next visit did not come with a folder, and somehow that made it more revealing than anything Vanessa had placed in front of me before, because when people stop preparing evidence, they start speaking freely, and that is when truth begins to surface without effort. They arrived later than usual, the sun already dipping low enough to cast long shadows across the living room floor, and Vanessa did not bother. With the same careful pleasantries she had used before. She moved through the house with a familiarity that no longer asked for permission, her hand brushing lightly against the back of a chair, her eyes lingering just a second too long on the walls, the shelves, the quiet details that once belonged to a life she had never helped build. Daniel followed her in, slower this time, his expression more relaxed than I had seen in weeks, as if something inside him had already settled into expectation. We were in the area, he said, though we all knew that was not true. I nodded and gestured toward the kitchen, where I had already set out 3 cups, the coffee still warm, the routine intact. Vanessa did not sit immediately. Instead, she remained standing for a moment, glancing toward Daniel before speaking, and in that brief exchange, I saw something new, not hesitation, but confirmation. "Evelyn," she began, her voice calm but no longer softened, "we have been thinking about timing." The word landed differently this time, less like a suggestion and more like a decision already made. I wrapped my hands around my cup, letting the warmth settle into my palms as I waited. "If you are serious about moving," she continued, "it would make sense to start preparing the house now. Cleaning it up, maybe moving some of your things out gradually. It will make the transition easier." Transition. Not if. Not when. Just how. Daniel nodded beside her, his voice quieter but aligned. "It is probably better to get ahead of it, Mom. Avoid any last-minute stress." I took a slow sip of coffee, giving myself a moment before responding, not because I needed time to think, but because silence has a way of inviting people to fill it, and I had learned that what they choose to add often matters more than what they say first. Vanessa stepped closer then, resting her hand lightly on the back of the chair across from me. "We can also start looking at offers," she added, almost casually. "There is a lot of interest in homes like this right now. It would be a shame to miss the opportunity." There it was. Not concern. Not assistance. Opportunity. I lowered my cup carefully onto the table and looked. At her, really looked this time, at the certainty in her posture, the quiet confidence in her voice, the complete absence of doubt. "You have given this a lot of thought," I said evenly. She smiled, not bothering to hide it anymore. "Of course. We just want to make sure everything works out for everyone." For everyone. The phrase lingered, heavy with implication, and I felt something inside me settle into place with absolute clarity. This was no longer about what was best for me. It had not been for a long time. I nodded slowly, allowing my expression to soften just enough to match the version of me they believed in. "I suppose you are right," I said, and watched as the last trace of restraint disappeared from her face. Daniel exhaled quietly, a small release of tension he probably did not realize he had been holding, and Vanessa finally took her seat, her movements relaxed, assured, as if the outcome was no longer a question. And in that moment, as their voices filled the space with plans that grew more specific, more detailed, more certain, I understood that they had crossed a line they could not see. They were no longer guiding the situation. They were exposing themselves to it. And I did nothing to stop them, because sometimes the most important thing is not what you say, but what you allow others to reveal when they believe there is nothing left to hide. The meeting was not my idea, but I was the one who suggested it, and that was the first thing that unsettled Vanessa, though she did not show it immediately. "Maybe we should sit down with a lawyer," I had said the evening before, my voice quiet, almost uncertain, as if I were asking for guidance rather than directing the next step. "Just to make sure everything is done properly." She paused for only a fraction of a second before agreeing, but I saw it, that brief flicker behind her eyes, the moment where expectation met something slightly different. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed relieved, as if the suggestion confirmed everything he had been hoping for without having to say it himself. The appointment was set quickly, faster than necessary, which told me more than any words could have. They were eager. They believed we were nearing the end. When we arrived at the office, Vanessa walked in first, her posture composed, her expression confident, as if she had already rehearsed this moment. Daniel followed closely, glancing around with mild curiosity, but not concern. I walked behind them, my steps steady, my pace unhurried, taking in the details without reacting, the quiet reception area, the the framed certificates on the walls, the soft hum of conversation from behind closed doors. We were shown into a conference room where a man in his late 50s stood to greet us, his demeanor professional but warm, his handshake firm. "Mrs. Carter," he said, looking directly at me, not at Vanessa, not at Daniel. "I am glad you could come in." I nodded, taking my seat at the head of the table without hesitation, and for a brief moment, I noticed Vanessa's expression tighten before she adjusted it back into something pleasant. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The lawyer began by asking general questions, about the house, about my plans, about what I wanted moving forward, and I answered simply, calmly, offering just enough to keep the conversation moving without giving anything away. Vanessa leaned in often, adding details, clarifying points, steering the discussion with a confidence that suggested she believed she understood the full picture. "We have already looked into some options," she said at one point, sliding her folder across the table as if presenting evidence. "We just want to make sure everything is handled efficiently." The lawyer nodded, glancing at the documents briefly before setting them aside, his attention returning to me. "And what is it that you want, Mrs. Carter?" he asked again, his tone measured, patient. I allowed a small pause, letting the question settle, letting the room grow just quiet enough for the weight of it to be felt. Then I folded my hands together and met his gaze. "I want to make sure that everything is in order," I said. "Exactly as my husband intended." The shift was subtle, but it was there. Vanessa's posture straightened slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to suggest she had not expected that answer. Daniel glanced at me, then quickly away, as if something about the direction of the conversation made him uncomfortable. The lawyer nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said, and reached for a folder on his desk, one that had not been brought in by Vanessa, one that had already been waiting. "Then perhaps we should review what your husband put in place," he said. And in that moment, as the room seemed to settle into a new kind of silence, I realized that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to. They believed they were here to finalize a plan. They believed this was the last step before everything became theirs to manage. And as I sat there, calm, composed, and completely certain, I understood that what came next would not be a surprise to me. Only to them. The lawyer opened the folder slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention, as if he understood that what he was about to reveal would not simply answer questions, but redefine them, and I remained still, my hands resting lightly on the table, my gaze steady, while Vanessa leaned forward just slightly, her attention sharpening in a way that betrayed her anticipation. "Your husband was very specific," the lawyer began, his voice calm, measured, each word placed carefully, about how his estate should be handled. Vanessa nodded faintly, her expression composed, confident, as if she expected nothing more than confirmation of what she already believed. Daniel sat beside her, quieter now, his posture less certain, his eyes moving between the lawyer and the documents in front of him. I said nothing. I did not need to. The lawyer continued, turning a page with deliberate precision. "The primary residence," he said, "remains under your full control, Mrs. Carter. There are no provisions requiring you to sell, transfer, or relinquish ownership unless you choose to do so." The word settled into the room, and for a brief moment, there was silence, not confusion, but adjustment. Vanessa blinked once, slowly, her smile tightening just enough to reveal that something had not aligned with her expectations. "Of course," she said quickly, her voice steady, though slightly sharper than before. "We just thought it would be more practical given the circumstances." The lawyer did not respond to her. Instead, he turned another page. "In addition," he said, "there are financial accounts set aside separately from the property, accounts that were structured to ensure long-term stability and independence." I watched Vanessa's posture shift, her confidence beginning to recalculate, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she processed the direction this was taking. Daniel leaned forward now, his interest suddenly more focused, as if he were beginning to realize that there was more to this than he had been told. "These accounts," the lawyer continued, "are solely in Mrs. Carter's name and are not subject to distribution under any assumptions or informal agreements." Vanessa's fingers tightened against the edge of the table, a small movement, but one she did not fully control. "What kind of accounts?" she asked, her tone still composed, but no longer relaxed. The lawyer met her gaze briefly, then returned his attention to the document. The total value, he said, is $28 million. The number did not echo in the room, but it did not need to. It landed quietly, precisely, and I felt the shift immediately, not in the air, but in them. Daniel's breath caught, just slightly, his eyes widening before he could stop himself, while Vanessa went completely still, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second before she forced it back into something controlled. I did not move. I did not react. I simply sat there, as I had been, as if nothing had changed, because for me, nothing had. The lawyer continued, his voice unchanged. There are also conditions attached, he said, turning another page. Conditions your husband included to ensure that these assets would be managed in accordance with his wishes. Vanessa spoke again, more quickly this time. What kind of conditions? The lawyer did not rush his answer. Any attempt to pressure, influence, or manipulate Mrs. Carter into decisions regarding her residence or financial assets, he said clearly, results in immediate disqualification from any future discretionary benefits or considerations outlined in the extended estate plan. The silence that followed was no longer adjustment. It was recognition. Daniel leaned back slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to realization, while Vanessa remained perfectly still, her composure intact, but thinner now, more fragile. I finally spoke then, my voice calm, steady, unchanged. Richard was always very thoughtful, I said, and let the words settle without elaboration. No one responded immediately. They did not need to. Because in that moment, everything that had been assumed, everything that had been planned, everything that had been quietly expected, had been replaced by something far simpler and far more final. They had believed they were guiding my future. They had believed I was the one with nothing left. And as I rose slowly from my seat, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my dress, I realized that the truth did not need to be explained, defended,